So when Euphoria was first released, it was reviewed on the cover of the New York Times Book Review as a taut, witty, fiercely intelligent tale of competing egos and desires in a landscape of exotic menace. Now, doesn't that sound like one exciting tale? Lily King is the author of 4 novels, most recently the New York Times bestseller, Euphoria, which was named one of the New York Times 10 best books of 2014, won the New England Book Award, the Kirkus Prize, and was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. Rights have been sold in 11 countries, and a film is on the way. Oh yeah, exciting. Lily is also the recipient of a McDowell Fellowship. She lives with her family in Maine, where she has found an agreeable rhythm to the seasons, allowing a comfortable and productive routine to pursue her creativity. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to present to you Lily King.
Wow. Thank you so much, Kim, and thank you so much to Deschutes Public Library and to the Deschutes Public Library Foundation. And a huge thank you to Chantal, who invited me here and has held my hand since the moment I arrived, and has been so kind and thinking of everything. I'm so grateful to you. And I'm so grateful to her whole team at the library, to Liz and Tina and Susie and Anne and everything that you've done for this entire month. I really can't quite believe it, and it's very intimidating because if all of you have participated in any of the events that have been going on, you know so much more about my book and about Margaret Mead and about anthropology and about Papua New Guinea and about malaria than I do. And so I'm a little scared about the question and answer session, but and that I thought that was so fascinating to hear Margaret Mead speaking about these things that are exactly our problems today, and as if no time had gone by, and a little intimidated to follow her. I thought that I would tell you, first of all, I just have to say how honored I am also to be here and to actually have arrived in Bend, which is kind of mythic in my imagination. And I knew about this place for many years, and it has lived up and gone beyond all of the talk about this town. And you all are very, very lucky to live here, as I'm sure you know. And what a vibrant, wonderful, incredible literary community you have. It's so impressive. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about how I started writing and how I stumbled on to Margaret Mead and this crazy idea of writing a novel sort of very, very, very loosely based on some of the things that happened to her between the years of 1931 and 33. So when I got married, my mother gave me as a gift a wedding dress of my own design. And so she sent me back to Mr. Nicolosi, who was the dressmaker in our town when I was growing up. And we went through books and, you know, I picked out things and designed my wedding dress. And as he was measuring me, Mr. Nicolosi said, you know, I remember when you were 6 years old and you rode your bike up to my door, and you know your mother was having a dress fixed or something, and I came in and I had a little tablet and a pencil, and I looked at him and I said, I'm going to be a writer someday. I have absolutely no recollection of this. I really think he made it up, but the very first thing I remember is reading Judy Blume. I was about 8 years old or 7 years old when her first book came out, Are You There, God, It's Me, Margaret? And then my mother got it for me and I devoured it. Like I had never devoured a book before. I mean, I loved books, but back then, books were, they were kind of science fiction for kids, or they had talking animals, and I didn't like either of those things. And this was the first book of realism I had read. And I read that book, and it made me want to do it, and I had never had that feeling before. And then my mother brought me, It's Not the End of the World, and that's about a girl whose parents are divorcing. And interestingly enough, my mother left my father about 2 months after she gave me that book. But I didn't figure that out for a while. But that book really, A, it really helped me through my parents' divorce, and B, it really made me want to be a writer. And the only other thing I remember is that when I was in 5th grade, my best friend, Amy Mix, came up to me and showed me a notebook that she had, and she said, "I'm writing a novel," and she had 25 pages. And I thought to myself, well, I want to write a novel. And so I went home and I started writing, and I got about 20 pages in, and I read them over, and I was like, oh, I've completely ripped off the Partridge Family. It was, about 5 kids in a bus, and they were very musical, and I kind of put that aside, and I decided I had to wait until I got my own ideas. And then, and we didn't really we had no creative writing in my grammar school and my grade school at all. And then I got to high school, and I had this really, really great English teacher named Mr. Paulus, and he had us, one of the first things he had us do was write a poem. And then one of the second things he had us do was write a short story. And when he was handing back the short story, he said to me, I teach a creative writing class to juniors and seniors. I think you should take it. And so I sat and I waited for that class for 2 years. It was all I wanted to do. I knew it. And so I took that class, and I handed in my first short story, and it was a sort of an epistolary short story about a girl who lived in a little log cabin in the middle of the sort of Midwest somewhere. And I was a junior, and there were seniors in the class, and they all called it my Little House on the Prairie story. So I have to say, I watched so much TV when I was a kid that it was really hard to get the TV out of my creative writing at first. And so my teacher very kindly said, just write what you know, write what you know. And so I started writing what I knew. And I had, at that point, my parents had divorced, and my father had remarried a woman with 3 kids, and then my mother had remarried a man with 7 children. And then soon after that, my father divorced his woman with 3 kids and married a woman with 4 kids. And so by the time I was a senior in high school, I had 4 families. And so I had a lot to write about. They were all very different, and sometimes I think that I was interested in sort of writing about anthropology because I think I was always kind of studying those families and trying to figure out how to fit in and not cause waves. And every family has its own sort of dynamic. And so I was sort of a student of that, I think, early on. And I think it's what made me be a writer, just that observer in me. And so I tried to write stories about what I knew, and then one time when I was senior, I handed in a short story that was kind of about a breakdown that somebody in my family had. And it was handed back to me by my teacher, and he said, we can't publish this in the student magazine, it's just too personal. And I thought, okay, so the rule is write what you know, but don't write everything you know. And that was really confusing to me. So I went back to making things up. And I went to college, and I never wrote about my family. I never wrote anybody. I felt like it was a bad thing that I had done. And so I went to UNC Chapel Hill because they had a great English department. And I wrote short stories there. And then actually my junior year summer, I went to France. It was my first time in Europe. And there's somebody in the audience named Kat and Mike, who I met at the airport, and they were both on that program with me, and now they live in Bend, and it's so great to see them after 32 years. But anyway, Kat and Mike and a bunch of us went to Paris one weekend, and I took one look at Paris, and I was like, I need to live here. And so I went back to school, and I was always a waitress in college, and so I graduated, and I just made enough money to be able to go to Paris. And I took a job as an au pair, and I was there kind of writing, but not really knowing how to do that. And then I came back, and still kind of trying to write, but I didn't have any models or anything about how one does this, and my friends started like getting real jobs and real careers, and so I heard about this thing called graduate school in creative writing, and honestly, I don't think anyone in my family had gone to graduate school, and I learned about these creative writing programs, and they give you a scholarship, and so I applied, and I went to Syracuse, New York to study with the writer Tobias Wolff, who I adored, and so I wrote stories there. And at the end of graduate school, I realized I really wanted to write a novel. And so I kind of shoved 2 short stories together and thought, okay, this will be the beginning of the novel. And then I didn't have, I had a degree in creative writing. And so I was completely unemployable. And I went to Spain. I sent out a bunch of letters, and I went to Spain and worked in a high school there teaching English. And in the summers, I would work on this novel. And then I came home after 2 years. And the rest of, another 8 years went by, okay, after getting that novel idea. And I think I moved about 10 times. I had 11 different jobs. I had a few different boyfriends. All my friends, were now lawyers, and, everybody was moving on. Fortunately, my family did not do anything awful, like be embarrassed by me or tell me I had to get my life together or anything. I continued being a waitress. Sometimes I taught English, and I just moved and I moved, and the novel was really my home. I mean, it was my place, and I just kind of put everything that went on kind of into the novel, although it would get translated because the novel was about a family in France, but it was just, kind of a vessel for everything, and it was really important to me. And then when I was living in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I met my husband, and I sold my novel, and I got pregnant in the same month of June 1998. And I had always written about families, always. I don't know why, but anytime I had a character, like her sister would walk through the door, or her father would, come in, and then I had a baby, and I was on the other side of this mother equation, this family equation, and I was really scared. I mean, my family kind of had exploded, and I had these 4 different families, and it was very confusing, and I knew how complicated families were, and I was really worried that I wasn't going to get it right. And so I wanted to start another novel. I'd done the first one, and I had another baby, and I was starting another novel, and I just decided to write about an absolute disaster of a mother. And she made me feel so much better about myself. So it was really, really helpful to just throw it all in there. And I with my 2 kids and my work, I really struggled with that work-family balance. I just didn't know if it was possible to be a good mother and a decent writer at the same time. And if you look at my notebooks from the time, you can see little math equations. And I was constantly doing the babysitting math, because I had gotten a babysitter when my first child was about 6 months old to come in for a few hours twice a week, and then a few hours 3 times a week. And sometimes it would be maybe 5 days for 3 hours, or 3 days for 5 hours. And I would add up the number of hours that my children were awake in the week. And then I would subtract the babysitting hours. And it would usually work out to be about 72 or 75 hours versus, the 15 that I was working. I was like, okay, is that okay? Is that okay? Does that make me a terrible mother? And then this went on for years. And then finally, something truly amazing happened. My children went to school. And I didn't have to worry about it anymore. I mean, they went to school. That was plenty of time for me to write, and I was lucky that I got to stay home and do the writing. And I feel like having children really brought my own childhood to the surface. It made me want to write more directly about this kind of family dysfunction and about alcoholism, which had been a big part of my family. And so I started this book, Father of the Rain, and I kind of took a lot of the emotions from my childhood and then kind of, fictionalized a whole lot of things. And when I was about a few weeks into starting that book, Father of the Rain, we had moved to Maine by then, and a brand new friend of mine named Cornelia had come over to my house, and she said, I'm going to take you to this bookstore that I really, really love, and I think you'll love it. And so I went, and it was going out of business, and she was so upset, and there was, there were all these signs up, and there was hardly anything in the store left to buy, and I really felt like I had to buy something. And so I looked around, and it was like cookbooks and like Carl Sagan stuff, and finally I landed on this biography of Margaret Mead. And I picked it up. I bought it for $5, thinking I will never read this book, but at least I bought something. And I brought it home, and I put it by my bed, and I did start reading it, and it was really good. It's by Jane Howard, and I thought it was so much more compelling than a lot of biographies are. Like with biographies, I kind of want to know the information. I just want them in my head, like as a chip, but I don't want to have to go through the slog of, every single fact. I want a narrative, and this was really a narrative. And I got to chapter 11, and I read that she was with her second husband, and she was in Papua New Guinea, and they were having a really difficult time, and they were going to go to Australia, and then they decided to go see the only other anthropologist in the whole area, Gregory Bateson. And Margaret Mead said in her memoir that she met him, they talked for 36 hours straight, and she fell madly in love with him. And I thought, wow, that's kind of an interesting story. I really like claustrophobic situations, and that was a super claustrophobic situation. So I was writing Father of the Rain, though, and I had just started it, and I had a really hard time writing Father of the Rain. I would write it, and it would come out in spurts, and then I would have to put it aside for long periods of time, sometimes months, and I didn't know what was going on there, but it kind of took me really, really low, and I had these little kids, and I didn't want to go that low, and so I kind of have to stop. And when I took these breaks, I started reading more about Margaret Mead, and I read, Coming of Age in Samoa, and I read Sex and Temperament, which is the book she wrote about those 3 tribes that she was studying during that time. And I read a wonderful biography by David Lipset about Gregory Bateson, which is really compelling and makes you fall madly in love with him. And I read everything I could, and I started keeping this green notebook, and I'd write down a detail, and then like a scene would jump up, and I'd start writing that. So I kind of started sneaking around with Margaret Mead while I was trying to write Father of the Rain. And I finished Father of the Rain, and then I had to decide, am I really going to do this? I cannot tell you. I really thought, that would be a good idea for somebody else to write. I do not write historical fiction. I do not write about people who don't have running water. It was just so far from anything, and I knew nothing about anthropology. I never even took an anthropology class in college, so it was for somebody else, but I was just curious, and so I had this notebook, but I also had this notebook of ideas, and so when I was done with Father of the Rain, I had this other idea about this other love triangle, more contemporary, much more fictional, and I had this summer where I couldn't decide what novel to write, and I was like in my love triangle. I was in my own love triangle with my ideas, and then finally I decided, okay, I'm going for this Mead idea, and I really didn't know much about her when I started. Joan Frank is a writer and a reviewer for the San Francisco Chronicle, and she wrote, when she reviewed Euphoria, she wrote that her image of Margaret Mead had been a doughy, dotty brain box, kin in warbles and waddles to Julia Child and Eleanor Roosevelt. Isn't that so incredible? That's an incredible sentence, I think. And I wrote her about it because I just thought it was so incredible. And that's exactly what I thought, exactly. And, but I was reading, doing this research on the young Margaret Mead and everything that happened with them. And I was really, really compelled primarily by that dynamic between the 3 people and their different perspectives. And when you write even a short story, your teacher will always say, what does the character want? You always have to have characters who want something. And these 3 characters wanted something so different from from what the others wanted, and they were all sort of at cross purposes, and it just seemed like a fertile situation. And so I had this green notebook, and for years I just had the green notebook and some starred ideas in it, just some sort of flights of fancy. And then I got 3 sentences, and I wrote the sentences down in the notebook. And really, I had those sentences, and they're pretty much the sentences that start the book, and I felt it, like it just kind of went into being a novel. And I did really, truly plan to tell, my first idea was to really try to tell the real story, and to find as much out about it as I could, and call her Margaret, and call him Andrew, and, keep everything sort of on the up and up. And I think I wrote about 4 pages like that, and I felt so constrained and constricted, and my fiction, I was a novelist, I was not a biographer, and I just needed to free myself, and I needed to do what I felt, as a fiction writer should happen. And so I often think of it as kind of like a train. You have the train of fiction, or you have the train of what happened to Margaret Mead, and you have my train of the novel. And I thought we were going to kind of be on parallel tracks, and we went off, and we just went like that. And I had to let myself do that. And I really did think still I was going to tell the story of a kick-ass American anthropologist who was named Nell and maybe had some similarities to Margaret Mead. And then I wrote chapter 2, and I could access Andrew Bankson and his mind so much more closely and so much more thoroughly. I just felt an incredible connection to him. At first I felt a connection to him because I thought that I could write about someone falling in love with him because I was so in love with him. Don't tell my husband. But when I started writing him, I realized, I can kind of be him more easily than I can be her, probably because she was inspired by Margaret Mead, and she is so famous, and there's so much baggage that comes with writing a character who actually existed. And I mean, he existed too, but he was much more in my mind. I knew so much less about him, really, and he was kind of a more fertile ground, I guess, for me to have him tell the story. The minute I started writing chapter 2, it felt like his story, and that really changed everything about the book. And really by then, I knew in real life, all 3 of them end up in Sydney Harbor, and they go their separate ways temporarily. She goes back to America, and actually Rayo Fortune, her husband, stays in Australia, and Bateson goes back to England. And then, the real life story is that she and Bateson get married, and they stay married for about 12 years. They have a child, and then they get divorced. It wasn't the most romantic ending in the world. And so I knew I really was going to have to come up with something different, and then when it turned out to be his story, it really, really, really changed the way the ending happened. So I thought I would show you just a little bit about my process, which is very antiquated. It's all by hand at first. And so this is my first notebook from writing the novel. And I always write, just in a lined notebook with a pencil, spiral notebook, exactly the way I wrote in high school. I've never changed my process. And I really like doing that because I think my sentences are different when I write by hand. I think they're starting to do some sort of neuroscience about that, why that might be. But it's very choppy, kind of subject-verb when I write on the computer. And also on the computer, it looks so much more polished than it actually is. And so I like to have it look unpolished, and I like to be able to draw in the margins. Sometimes I have to make little drawings to kind of visualize it. And I like being able to write in the margins. I like being able to cross out and then be able to see through my crossouts, because you delete it on the computer and you can't get it back, and that was the brilliant thing you were supposed to have. And so I write very chronologically. I just start at the beginning and try to go forward. And as I write, I get ideas. And so then in the back of every notebook, I always keep notes. And so I have a big kind of 20 pages blank that I just fill in with ideas like, oh yeah, this could happen, that could happen, this could happen. And then when I kind of forget what all my ideas are and when I was going to put them, I make a timeline. This is where my dear friend Susan says, okay, here comes the crazy, because it is kind of crazy. I write very, very small, and I just make a line across. It reminds me of being in third grade, and like my number line on my desk. And then I go down. I know you can't possibly see this, but we're just going to pretend you can. And I write. I just have little ideas, like little tiny moments. They are not chapters. I am so not type A, much more like type Z. And so they're just little tiny moments. And E.L. Doctorow has a great quote about writing, which is, writing a book is like driving across country at night. You can only see 3 feet in front of you, but you always get where you're going. And I feel like these are my little 3 feet. I'm like, okay, then I'll go there, and then I'll go there. And then sometimes it doesn't work, and I have to retrace my steps and then go in another direction. But it helps, and then other times I completely abandon. I don't even. This kind of breaks my heart to read this, because there are a lot of scenes that I actually think are kind of good ideas that I forgot. Somehow I didn't consult my timeline enough, which was not very smart. And then at the very, very last thing on this timeline, it says, have some sort of culminating moment. I had no idea. I had no idea where we were going, but I knew I had to have a culminating moment because I had taken high school English. And then at the end, very, very end, I always, because I was a waitress for so many years, and and before that I worked in Burger King, and we always had a punch clock. And so this is kind of my punch clock, and it's like a writing log, and I just write the day that I wrote and how much I wrote. And I am not the kind of person, who beats herself up. I think there are a lot of writers who sit down and like, I'm not getting out of this chair until I've written 7,000 words. And I gotta go pick up my kids at 3:15, so that is not happening. I just do what I can, and I keep going, but I try to be there every weekday that I can. Oh, and then I'll just say one more thing about the process, and that is that my favorite part is taking a notebook or a chapter, it depends when I feel like doing it, and putting it onto the computer. And that is such a rich process for me, because I feel like this is all about creativity. This is my creative self. I try not to put any censors. I don't bring the critic in, the person who's like, that sucks. This is gonna be a disaster. Don't do this, that's a bad image. I try to leave that voice, which can be helpful, but not when you're doing your first draft. I leave that voice very consciously outside the door. And then when I turn on the computer and it's time to put it onto to a file, then that voice can kind of come in, and the creator and the critic can kind of work together and come up with a better draft. And I find it to be a very, very fertile time sometimes. I mean, I know I'm romanticizing it because there are a lot of days where it's really hell. But it is, I love that part. And then when I have the whole draft, I'll print it out and I'll set it aside for 3 weeks or something, and I'll try to distract myself with anything that I can, and then I'll go back to it and I'll read it and I'll take notes, and I'll do a lot of handwriting on that manuscript, and then do another draft, and then do it again until I finally feel like it's ready for somebody else to see, usually my husband. And then I also have a writer's group, and so when I'm brave enough, I show it to them, and they give me some feedback, and then I give it to my agent, and then I give it to my editor, and that's sort of how it goes from my little notebook that I bought at Staples to this. And I think it's really important to demystify that process, because I think there are a lot of people who want to write and really should be writing, and so I really encourage you all to go get your notebook. Okay, thank you, and I'm so happy to answer any questions that you might have. Thank you.